For many of us, the Super Nintendo was more than a video game system. It was a gateway to new worlds, new experiences, and brand new addictions. However, Nintendo was actually in no rush to develop their new system. Honestly, in the 80s, they were coasting on the success of the Nintendo Entertainment System, which had an unparalleled lead on any other home console system and sold more than 60 million units before production was stopped. That being said, in 1987, NEC Home Electronics released the PC Engine, the first 16-bit system. Then, in the summer of 1989, the Sega Genesis was released. This forced Nintendo to accelerate their plans and release the Super Famicom in 1990. The North American version, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, was released in August 1991. And that is one of the 75 facts you're going to hear throughout the course of this video. This system was one of the best in the market at the time. It came with enhanced graphics, larger sprites, parallax scrolling, meaning an illusion of scrolling depth due to background items scrolling at different speeds, and the ability to display more than 4,000 colors at a time. The system hit Japan on Wednesday, November 21st, 1990. 300,000 units were gone within hours. In fact, the release of the game caused not insignificant breaks in society, including civil disturbances and businesses lacking workers who took the day off to buy and play the new system. As a result, the Japanese government asked that video game systems only be released on weekends, a tradition that is still adhered to in Japan. The devices came with a massive marketing blitz, particularly in Japan. They certainly got quite a bit of attention from a few people, including the Yakuza, or Japanese mafia. Due to fear of systems being robbed by the Yakuza, they were only shipped at night. Different regions saw different launch games. In Japan, only Super Mario and F-Zero were available when the system launched. In America, those two games were still around, along with Pilot Wings, SimCity, and Gradius 3. Different games received different marketing resources, with each game earning a score on a 40-point scale. The higher the score, the more marketing the game received. Furthermore, each region performed their own marketing evaluation, which makes sense. After all, what worked in Japan may not work in America. The Super Nintendo's run went from 1990 to 2005. The last games produced for the system were Kirby's Dream Land 3 in Japan. In North America, it was Frogger, which was released in October 1998, almost a year after the November 1997 release of the previous last game, Timon and Pumbaa's Jungle Games. Even after the Super Nintendo system stopped being manufactured, many games were ported to the Game Boy Advance. Super Nintendo produced a lot of games during its time in production. How many? 1,746 official games. However, different regions had different games available. In fact, 978 of these games were only released in Japan, 111 of these games were only released in the United States, and a mere 34 games were European exclusive. Only 295 games were actually sent to all three regions. Speaking of different regions, here's where things get interesting. You could not play games made for one region on a system made for another region. Why? Well, the systems were built differently, and cartridges made for the North American system would not fit in the Super Famicom, and vice versa. There were also internal chips that prevented PAL region games from being played on North American and Japanese systems. These issues could be overcome with adapters, but even then, some games played more sped up than others. Oh, and if you have certain versions of Super Nintendo, this may look familiar to you. An ABS plastic was used on some of the early versions of the Super Nintendo and Super Famicom. As a result, over time, the system would turn this charming piss yellow color. Newer systems use different plastics, and the yellowing could be reversed via retrobrightening, a procedure that coated the system with chemicals and exposed it to UV light. Speaking of design, the American version of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System had a curved top. The reason? To discourage players from putting their drinks on top of the system, which actually led to many spilled cans of Coke and many ruined systems on flat-topped Nintendo Entertainment Systems. Unlike many other video game systems, the SNES had no backwards compatibility. In other words, if you had the Nintendo, you had to keep the Nintendo system to play games on them. However, in a 1989 issue of Computer and Video Games, a prototype Famicom adapter would have allowed users to hook their Nintendos up to their Super Nintendos to play Nintendo games. The feature was later cut, with some speculation being that it was cut to save money. Strangely enough, other adapters did make it onto the market. For example, the Super Game Boy adopted Game Boy games for Super Nintendo use. Another way Nintendo was ahead of its time? The Satellaview. This 1995 device, available only for the Super Famicom, allowed players to download original games, episodes, levels, magazines, and other forms of media. The platform was in existence from 1995 to 2000, but it was discontinued due to the financial collapse of developer Saint Giga. In fact, as originally designed, the Satellaview could have created a platform for indie developers. In a 1995 interview, Shigeru Miyamoto said, quote, "Satellaview offers us the possibility to distribute content for free that might otherwise be difficult to sell. Something like that would incur a high cost if we were to try to sell it on the current cartridge standard, but if we only had to send the data, distribution becomes much more doable." This statement would be deeply prophetic with platforms like Steam, the PlayStation Store, the Nintendo Store, the Xbox Store, and more. The successor system to the Super Nintendo was the N64, but it was very nearly the Nintendo PlayStation. In 1991, Nintendo partnered with Sony to develop a CD-based system. Licensing and revenue sharing got in the way of the partnership, so Nintendo very abruptly broke it off and partnered with Philips to produce the CDI. The system was a total disaster, and Sony would use the technology developed with Nintendo to create the PlayStation. Whoops. Compared to the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Super Nintendo had some pretty wild peripherals, many of which were absolutely required to play certain games. For example, there was Mario Paint. This art-inspired game system allowed players to create their own art, music, and fill in coloring pages. It was extremely different than anything else available on the Super Nintendo, and no other game created for the system truly captured its creative spirit. Mario Paint is the game best known for using a computer mouse for operation. No mouse, no game. However, a variety of other games supported the mouse. This included Jurassic Park, Doom, King Arthur's World, and more. Mario Paint was a huge hit, selling 2.3 million copies and becoming the 19th best-selling game for the Super Nintendo. It was also the best-selling game for the system that couldn't be operated with a traditional Nintendo controller. For many, the part of Mario Paint that you remember the most was the Gnat Attack minigame, where your goal is to kill as many gnats as possible. This game was fun, but it was actually inserted to help ensure that players could successfully use the mouse, something that was not nearly as commonplace in 1992 as it is today. Mario Paint would serve as an entry point for many video games and later forms of media. For example, the first ever Homestar Runner, a very, very popular Flash cartoon from the early 2000s, was animated using Mario Paint. What is probably less known to non-Japanese audiences is that two other versions of Mario Paint were released. The first was downloadable on the Satellaview and made available in 1997 and could be used without the mouse. A Mario Paint 64, released as Mario Artist, was also available as a launch game for the Nintendo 64 in Japan. Then there was the Super Scope. This was a more advanced version of the light gun and shaped like a bazooka. Players could look through the scope and fire a trigger. It only supported 12 games and came packaged with the Super Scope 6. Unlike the light gun, which was connected through a standard wire, the Super Scope was wireless. However, it required the use of a receiver box that was plugged into a controller port. Furthermore, the game required 6 AA batteries to run. Unsurprisingly, the controller chewed through batteries very, very quickly. Nintendo itself only produced a few first-party peripherals, including a cleaning kit and the Scoremaster, which was a joystick with an auto-fire function. However, there were hundreds of third-party controllers, a baseball bat, an exercise bike, seriously, we did a video on it, check it out, a ski exerciser, a golf club, and more. They got really creative. However, nothing was as popular as the original controller. Keep in mind that the Super Nintendo controller was revolutionary in and of itself. Its 4-button scheme and 2 shoulder buttons are still largely used. If you remember our video on the regular Nintendo system, you may recall that strict violence restrictions were in place that limited blood, gore, and death that could be seen in Nintendo games. Those limitations also carried over into the Super Nintendo. However, this strict censorship gave alternatives to Nintendo, like the Sega, a major advantage. Many games, like Slaughter Sport and Pit Fighter, were inherently violent and allowed for a level of blood and gore that wasn't present on the Super Nintendo. This allowed Sega to tap into a more mature audience, and they did so with their marketing, including through famous campaigns like Sega does what Nintendo don't. This difference in marketing was in many ways that the console wars of the 1990s manifested themselves. Nintendo's dominance in this market was unchallenged until Sega began to press their advantage, innovate, and change marketing. By marketing themselves as a system with an attitude, Sega gained more market share. In fact, the console wars are directly responsible for Sonic the Hedgehog, who was given speed and a attitude in order to combat Nintendo's boring-seeming Mario. Sega's success against Mario led to a major challenge for Nintendo in a variety of respects. One such example, many of its third-party developers broke away from their exclusive Nintendo licenses and began to work with Sega. This included Konami, Acclaim, Capcom, and more. How successful was Sega against Nintendo? Well, in 1990, Nintendo had a 90% market share of the home video game market. By 1993, Sega had a 55% market share, a massive. In the end, Nintendo didn't so much win the console wars as Sega lost. Sega had massive corporate debt and made the decision to launch the Sega Saturn, a 32-bit system, early. Too early. With too many systems still in use, Sega shifted its concentration to the Saturn, which never achieved the same success as other consoles. Nintendo focused on the Super Nintendo until it made the jump to the Nintendo 64 in 1996. That being said, all of these systems struggled against the PlayStation. The console wars had a variety of long-term impacts on the video game industry, including the establishment of the ESRB, or Entertainment Software Ratings Board. Seeking an advantage over Nintendo, who continued to censor their games, Sega licensed a version of Mortal Kombat that came with blood and graphic violence. This influenced 1993 congressional hearings on video games, and that, in turn, led to the creation of the ESRB. For Nintendo, once again, censorship emerged in more ways than just restricting violence. For example, Nintendo continued to enforce a strict prohibition on the use of religion in its games. One such example? In Super Ghosts and Goblins, crosses were removed. Furthermore, a boss name was changed from Samael, an overtly religious name, to Saridas. This prohibition led to some other odd name changes. For example, in Japan, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past was originally called The Legends of Zelda: Triforce of the Gods. However, Nintendo's no religion policy forced that name to be changed. Speaking of The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past was the third canonically produced Zelda game. It featured many plot elements that would become staples of the series: parallel worlds, one of the bad guys being a minion of Ganon, the Master Sword, and a different version of Link than the one that we see in the first two Zelda games. It was also the first game to introduce what is arguably the funniest of the series staples. Hit the chickens too many times and, well, this happens. If you were familiar with this as a kid, you did it. I still remember doing it and cracking up. In a few spots, Zelda brings in other. For example, there are two connections to the Mario series in A Link to the Past. Mario can be seen as a character in Kakariko Village and in certain paintings. Additionally, the Chomp Chomps appear as enemies in Turtle Rock. Then, there's the story of the Chris Houlihan Room. Before The Legend of Zelda was published, Nintendo Power ran a contest. The winner would have their name in a hard-to-find secret room in The Legend of Zelda. Chris Houlihan won the contest. His room could be found if the player used the Pegasus boots the right way. Finally, did you know that Shigeru Miyamoto originally intended Zelda to use a party system, as is common in most role-playing games today? In an interview, Miyamoto said that The Legend of Zelda would feature a party that included a fighter who was a mix between a human and an elf, a magic user, and a girl. In fact, according to Miyamoto, the fairy that appeared in The Adventure of Link was actually a party member designed for Zelda 3. A Link to the Past was the third game in the Zelda series, and this is a theme that Nintendo comes back to over and over again in its best-selling games. Of the top 10 best-selling Super Nintendo games, only 2 were new properties: Super Mario Kart and Star Fox. Furthermore, 6 of these games were developed by Nintendo. 2 of them, Street Fighter II and Street Fighter II Turbo, were developed by Capcom. The other 2 were both Donkey Kong games and both developed by Rare. The best-selling RPG on the system was Final Fantasy VI, which sold 3.2 million units. However, this game was actually released as Final Fantasy III in its original American release. That's because multiple Final Fantasy games, including Final Fantasy II and III, were released years after their initial release in North America. Yeah, don't ask, really confusing. Final Fantasy VII is the second best-selling Final Fantasy game, behind only Final Fantasy XIV, which came out as an online MMORPG. As released, Final Fantasy VII came out on the PlayStation, where it helped push that system to become one of the most successful video game consoles of all time. However, in a different world, Final Fantasy VII may have been a Super Nintendo property. In fact, it started development as a Super Nintendo game in 1994. The limitations of the platform caused Square to shift development to the CD-ROM-based system of the PlayStation. The rest is gaming history. Unsurprisingly, this isn't the only Super Nintendo game that started its life in another format. Kirby Superstar, the third game in the Kirby series, was also developed as a regular Nintendo game. According to developers, that was just meant to be a prototype. The final version of the game that came out for the Super Nintendo was bigger, had better graphics, and better animation. One of the Super Nintendo's most popular games was Chrono Trigger, a cult classic RPG which somehow never got a real sequel or remake. Chrono Trigger has up to 12 endings on the Super Nintendo, although one of these endings has 5 different variants, so I guess you could call it 17 endings. The ending you get depends on your success in battling Lavos, where the battle takes place, and how soon you get there. The creator and designer of Chrono Trigger was Hironobu Sakaguchi. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Sakaguchi was also the brains and creator of the Final Fantasy series. Brief spoiler here, but look, this is for a game that's 30 years old, so, just let it go. Those of you who played Chrono Trigger know that the death of the main character, Chrono, plays a critical part in the story, although Chrono is brought back to life later on in the game. In the original version of the game, writers proposed that Chrono die and stay that way, with the party picking up an earlier version of Chrono to finish the game. Square, the developer and publisher of Chrono Trigger, found that idea to be way too depressing and ordered Chrono brought back to life earlier. In some ways, the Super Nintendo was the golden age of role-playing games. In addition to Chrono Trigger, many of the platform's most popular games were RPGs. This included 4 different Dragon Quests, Super Mario RPG, Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6, The Secret of Mana, and more. All of these games sold more than 1 million copies, but it's Final Fantasy 6 that holds the record for the best-selling Super Nintendo RPG. One of the most successful games of this era was Donkey Kong Country, which was produced by Rare and released in 1994. The game wasn't quite 3D, but it was pretty close, using pre-rendered graphics that allowed for much sharper gameplay and movement. How successful was it? Well, the game sold 6.1 copies in 45 days in 1994, making it the fastest-selling video game for that time. What's so funny about Donkey Kong's success is that it helped Rare become a Super Nintendo powerhouse. The game was so good that Nintendo purchased a minority share in the company, thus giving Nintendo greater access to Rare's success and ensuring that the company had a pipeline to future Nintendo games. This led to the creation of games like Donkey Kong Country 2, Killer Instinct, and Diddy Kong Racing. Now, it would be impossible to talk about the revolutionary Super Nintendo games without discussing Star Fox, one of the most successful properties of Nintendo that got its start on the Super Nintendo system. This action game was the first to use polygonal graphics on the SNES. What's more interesting, and what you may know if you got the SNES Classic, is that there was a second game, Star Fox 2, that was never released. The game was developed and completed, but Nintendo was concerned that it would fare poorly against the 3D games of the PlayStation. As such, the game was canceled, only to be released on the SNES Classic in 2019. Perhaps most interesting? As of this moment, the Star Fox series is dead. Including Star Fox 2, 9 Star Fox games were released, with the last 2, Star Fox Zero and Star Fox Guard, being released in 2016. However, there are rumors that a new Star Fox game could be released on the Switch too. The best-selling game on the system, unsurprisingly, is Super Mario World, selling 20.6 million units. What's a little more interesting is that the second best-selling game is Super Mario All-Stars. For many people, this was the first experience with video game remakes. Super Mario All-Stars came with refreshed versions of Super Mario 1, 2, and 3, all of which had enhanced graphics and the ability to save games. It also had the Lost Levels. For those of you who are unaware, this was the first time that the Lost Levels made a worldwide premiere. Lost Levels was released as Super Mario 2 in Japan, but the game was considered too difficult for Western audiences. It had a variety of deeply unforgiving components, including poison mushrooms, wind, harder level design, and more. As a result, the game made it to America and Europe only with the release of Lost Levels. Interestingly enough, Lost Levels came to exist largely because of a major gap between releases. Published interviews said that the idea of creating a value pack of games was Shigeru Miyamoto's, one that came as a result of the 3-year gap between the 1992 release of Mario Kart and the expected 1995 release of Yoshi's Island. Let's talk about Mario Kart. Worth noting, Mario Kart didn't start as Mario Kart. The game began as a regular, generic kart racing game, which morphed into Mario Kart when developers realized its potential. Mario Kart is one of the first games to use Mode 7 graphics. This system allows for certain graphical planes to be rotated separately. As a result, you can see an illusion of 3D. This can also be seen in games like F-Zero and Pilot Wings. Let's go back to Super Mario World. This game was the first to mention Bowser's 7 kids, all of whom were named after celebrities. This includes Iggy Pop for Iggy, Ludwig van Beethoven for Ludwig van Koopa, and Roy Orbison for Roy Koopa. Not meant with the kids in mind, I guess. These aren't the only musical shoutouts in the game. Remember these rhinos that appear as bosses in 4 Mario Fortresses? They're called Reznors, as in Trent Reznor, lead singer of Nine Inch Nails. There are a number of differences between the various regional versions of the game. For example, in Two Worlds, Vanilla Secret 3 and Chocolate Island 1, dolphins appear, and Mario can jump on these dolphins. However, in the Japanese version, Yoshi can eat the damn dolphins. Yes, that's right. Yoshi snacks on these delightful, majestic creatures, presumably scarring kids across Japan. Horse names are also different. For example, in the special world, the Way Cool stage is instead named, quote, Even the Mario staff is surprised. Which, call me crazy, is a lot funnier than Way Cool. Also, a quick note. Do you know how Mario gets Yoshi to extend its tongue? Well, if you said punches Yoshi in the back of his big green head, you're right. This fact was confirmed by developers in interviews, although they later changed it to say that Mario is actually pointing and commanding, yet presumably after a lawsuit was filed by PETA, whatever. Different colored Yoshis? Same colored arms. In Super Mario World, Yoshis came in standard green. Some levels also have them in yellow, red, and blue. However, no matter what, they always had orange arms. One theory goes that the reason for this was to make them stand out more against Yoshi's body. Yoshi's arms were changed to green in the Game Boy Advance. In most Super Mario games, including 1 and 3, Luigi and Mario have no differences in how they play. However, that wasn't always the case. For example, in the Game Boy Advance version of Super Mario 3, Luigi could actually jump higher, just like his character in Super Mario 2. Sports games were popular on the Super Nintendo, but not nearly as popular as they were on the original Nintendo. The best-selling sports game on the platform was NBA Jam, released in 1994 and selling more than 1.2 million copies. It was only the console's 40th best-selling game and the only sports game to sell more than 1 million copies on the system. NBA Jam had some pretty amazing cheat codes. In addition to the usual array of power-ups, NBA Jam allowed you to play as then-President Bill Clinton, Vice President Al Gore, and NFL quarterback Warren Moon for some reason. Another of Super Nintendo's more unique games was Earthbound. This RPG takes place in something approximating our world and follows the adventures of Ness, Pokey, and his friends as they investigate a nearby meteor crash. At the end of the game, you battle a fetus. What? Yeah, no, seriously. The game's main boss is Gygus, the being who has surrounded the world with hatred and evil, and thus turned many common objects and animals into violent fiends. The game basically features cartoon-like graphics and kid-friendly imagery, until you get to the end. In the final boss battle, you fight Gygus. You have to go back in time to kill Gygus at his weakest, walk through an area that absolutely looks like a womb, and then fight this fetus-like structure that looks like it's in an ovary. Sleep well tonight, kids. In lighter game facts, we all know that Tetris was a massive hit for Nintendo, but are you familiar with some of the offshoot Tetris games? Seeking to build off of Tetris' success, Nintendo and other developers produced many clones of the hit game. This included Tetris 2, Super Tetris 3, and Tetris Attack. My personal favorite, and a game that had more than a few marketing dollars behind it, was Zoop. Everything about this game screams 90s. Look at that neon and those little squiggly shapes. Anyway, among the more unique games for the Super Nintendo was Uniracers. You played as a unicycle, no rider, just the unicycle, and had to maneuver over numerous two-dimensional tracks. What is most interesting about this game is its developer, DMA Designs. Does that sound familiar? It might. DMA was purchased by Take-Two Interactive in 1999 and became Rockstar North. Among the games they went on to make, Grand Theft Auto. Speaking of unique games, ever heard of Mega Man Soccer? It sure was a thing. The game's plot, yeah, it had a plot, is that Dr. Wily's robots take over a soccer game, so Dr. Light sends Mega Man and other robots to stop them. Good lord. Anyway, that sure was the setup for Mega Man Soccer. I guess they got crazy desperate in the 90s. Game show games were also very popular on the system, including games like Jeopardy and Family Feud. Now, you might wonder about this. After all, these games had plenty of younger players who may not know how to spell things. Did they really know the answers? In some cases, it didn't actually matter. Games like Family Feud came with alternative answers like jail for prison. Furthermore, they had a text parser. This meant that you could actually answer with absolute garbage, but as long as the correct letters were present in the right order, you got the answer right. As you would imagine, the Super Nintendo also expanded significantly on its predecessor in terms of games you could play. This included city building. Do you remember playing SimCity on the Super Nintendo? The game obviously comes with reduced functionality than compared to its computer version, but it had more buildings and more scenarios. It also comes with an advisor, Dr. Wright, and Nintendo-oriented Easter eggs, including Bowser replacing Godzilla and a Mario statue. In the end, the Super Nintendo made a massive impact on the world. It sold more than 49 million units. However, in terms of overall major console sales, the Super Nintendo is right in the middle. It is the 16th best-selling console of all times. However, it did sell more than the Sega Genesis, which sold 30.75 million units. As such, Super Nintendo easily won the console wars. And as always, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this video because I sure liked making it. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and keep an eye out for more. Have a wonderful day out there, friends. Happy gaming.